When you hear the words private school, what's the first image that comes to mind? Maybe it's a perfectly manicured campus, students in crisp uniforms, classical music echoing through marble hallways. Maybe even privilege, wealth, power, a promise of success. And for many, that's exactly what private schools sell. Not just an education, but a lifestyle, an identity, a shortcut to elite universities and high-paying careers. But what if I told you that behind the polished image and glowing reputations, there are secrets that most people never hear about? Things that don't make it into the glossy brochures or the alumni newsletters. This isn't just about tuition fees or fancy facilities, it's about what really happens behind closed doors and who pays the price for all that prestige. Let's start with something that might surprise you. Private schools aren't necessarily better at teaching. Sure, they have smaller class sizes and more resources, but that doesn't always translate to better education. In many cases, what they're really offering is access. Access to networks, to connections, to the kind of social capital that opens doors before a student even graduates. It's less about learning and more about positioning. But that access comes with a cost, and not just financial. There's immense pressure on students to perform, to achieve, to embody the brand of the school. Mental health issues in private school environments are often just as high, if not higher, than in public schools. But they're much easier to hide. Why? Because appearances matter more than anything. Schools want to preserve their reputation. Parents want to believe their investment is worth it. And students? They're often stuck in the middle, afraid to fail in a place where failure isn't part of the script. And then there's the issue of discipline. You'd think with all the structure, there'd be consistency, but that's not always the case. Discipline can be selective, strict for some, lenient for others, especially if a student's last name happens to be engraved on the library wing. Some private schools operate more like businesses than educational institutions, where students who bring in the most money, publicity, or potential influence are quietly protected. Meanwhile, others are punished swiftly for minor mistakes. It creates a double standard, a hidden hierarchy that doesn't show up on the website, but everyone inside feels. And speaking of business, make no mistake, private schools are very aware of their brand. They curate everything, the students they admit, the teachers they hire, even the kinds of extracurriculars they showcase. Diversity? Sometimes it's more about optics than impact. Scholarships? Great, but often used to highlight inclusivity without addressing deeper inequalities. And the truth is, many students on scholarship can feel like outsiders, grateful to be there, but constantly reminded that they don't fully belong. What we're starting to see is a pattern, a system that values appearance over authenticity, reputation over reality, and we're just getting started. Inside the walls of many private schools, there's an invisible code, one that isn't written down in any handbook, but shapes every interaction, every opportunity, every consequence. And that code, it's rooted in power. Because beyond the academics and extracurriculars, private schools are, in many ways, microcosms of elite society. They're where future CEOs, politicians, and cultural leaders are shaped. And they don't just teach math or literature, they quietly teach hierarchy. You might not notice it at first, everyone looks the same in a blazer and tie, right? But spend enough time inside and the lines start to show. You'll hear last names whispered with reverence, the kind that means old money or important family. Some kids arrive at school already carrying legacies, sons and daughters of alumni, donors, or even celebrities. And that matters. These aren't just students, they're status symbols, and they're treated as such. Teachers know who they are. Administrators know who they are. Their mistakes are forgiven faster. Their accomplishments are celebrated louder. And when it comes time for college recommendations or leadership positions, they're almost always first in line. Not necessarily because they're more capable, but because they already fit the mold the school wants to promote. Meanwhile, students who don't come from wealth often find themselves navigating a different experience entirely. They may be on financial aid, but that doesn't mean they're treated equally. Many describe feeling like they're constantly proving themselves, working twice as hard for half the recognition. And socially, the divide can be even sharper. Conversations about vacations, designer clothes, or private tutors are casual for some, awkward for others. You quickly learn who has and who's just trying to keep up. Now let's talk about the staff. You might think working at a private school means better pay, better support, and more resources. And sometimes that's true. But in other cases, teachers find themselves under pressure to maintain the school's image rather than focus on actual education. If a wealthy parent complains about a grade, it's not uncommon for admin to take the parent's side, because keeping donors happy often takes priority over standing by the curriculum. Some teachers are even warned to avoid controversial topics in class, not for educational reasons, but to avoid upsetting influential families. And then there are the scandals. Yes, the ones you don't hear about. Because private schools have a way of keeping things quiet. Allegations of bullying, misconduct, even abuse can be swept under the rug in the name of protecting the school's reputation. Victims are sometimes encouraged to stay silent, to move forward, while the institution carries on untouched. After all, a single viral story can mean millions lost in donations and future enrollments. So instead of accountability, there's damage control. What we're seeing is a system designed not just to educate, but to preserve power. And that power is carefully protected, nurtured, and passed down, generation after generation. But this is only part of the picture. In the next section, we'll peel back the curtain even further and expose how these schools shape the world outside their walls, in ways you might not expect. Let's zoom out for a second. Private schools aren't just shaping students, they're shaping the world those students will eventually lead. Think about it. Many of today's most powerful politicians, CEOs, media moguls, and even judges once walked the halls of elite private institutions. And that's not a coincidence. These schools are pipelines, not just to Ivy League universities, but to influence, to legacy, to control. But how does that actually happen? It starts with relationships. At many of these schools, the real education happens outside the classroom. Students grow up side by side with the children of diplomats, entrepreneurs, and generational wealth. They learn to speak the same language, share the same values, build the same networks. These relationships follow them into college, internships, and eventually the boardroom. It's not just about what you know, it's who you've known since you were 12. And schools know this. In fact, they count on it. Some even advertise their alumni networks as a selling point. Your child won't just attend school here, they'll say. They'll join a lifelong community of leaders. That's not education, that's branding. That's social engineering. But here's the dark side of that influence. When power is concentrated in the hands of people from the same backgrounds, who've been trained in the same insulated systems, the world outside those walls starts to look a little less fair. Policies get made with a certain bias. Opportunities get distributed within a narrow circle. And those without access to elite schools, they're often left playing a game where the rules were written without them in mind. Even more concerning, these schools often pride themselves on being non-political or neutral, but that's misleading. Silence on issues of inequality, race, class, and justice isn't neutrality, it's complicity. When students are taught to avoid controversy instead of confronting it, they leave school unprepared to challenge the very systems they'll one day lead. They become defenders of the status quo, even when that status quo is harmful. And let's not forget the illusion of meritocracy. Private schools love to highlight stories of rising stars, students from disadvantaged backgrounds who earned a scholarship and went on to achieve great things. But those stories are rare for a reason. For every one student lifted up, there are dozens who never had a chance to apply. Not because they weren't smart or hardworking, but because they didn't have the resources, the information, or the connections to even get through the door. It's easy to look at these institutions and admire the architecture, the traditions, the polished graduates. But behind the prestige is a deeper truth. These schools don't just reflect inequality, they help maintain it. Quietly, elegantly, persistently. And yet the cracks are beginning to show. Whispers are turning into conversations. Former students are speaking out. Staff are starting to question long-standing policies. In the final part of this video, we're going to explore what happens when the truth finally comes to light, and whether private schools can ever truly change. It's easy to feel like these systems are too big, too established, too polished to ever be challenged. But the truth is, change is already happening. Slowly, sometimes quietly, but undeniably. And it often starts with the people who know the system best, the students and teachers who've lived it and are no longer willing to stay silent. More and more alumni from elite private schools are coming forward, on podcasts, in essays, through social media, sharing what it was really like behind the curtain. The stress, the pressure, the silence around mental health, the casual racism, the class divides. These aren't bitter rants. They're honest, vulnerable stories from people who benefited from the system and now feel a responsibility to call out its flaws. For the first time, the perfect facade is starting to crack. Some students have even taken things a step further, organizing petitions, demanding curriculum changes, pushing for transparency in hiring and admissions. A few schools have responded with statements and surface-level initiatives, but others are genuinely listening. Because the pressure isn't just internal anymore. Parents are asking more questions, teachers are speaking out, donors are re-evaluating their support. The idea that private schools are untouchable is beginning to fade. And let's not forget the role of social media. What used to be hidden can now be shared instantly with the world. Stories that would have been dismissed as isolated incidents are being connected, amplified, and brought into public conversations. That's power. It doesn't erase the damage done, but it does open the door for something new, for the first time in a long time. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Real change won't come just from inside the private school bubble. It has to come from all of us, by questioning how we define success, how we reward privilege, and what kind of education we want for the next generation. Because when we treat elite schooling as the only path to opportunity, we reinforce a system where access is everything, and equity becomes an afterthought. So what's the takeaway here? It's not that every private school is evil or that every student is complicit. It's that we've allowed certain institutions to operate with far too little scrutiny for far too long. We've mistaken polish for progress and tradition for truth. And as long as these schools continue to shape the minds and the power structures of our society, we have to keep asking questions. Because education should be about opening doors, not guarding gates. So the next time someone mentions a school with a fancy name, ask yourself, what aren't they telling you? And more importantly, who's being left out of the story?